Well, it turns out that we were all completely wrong about how training works in Football Manager. Alright, let me give you some context. For years, there have been many articles and many YouTube videos that have come out with advice on training schedules. I've used a lot of these schedules. This is one that I remember using, for example. The idea initially was to try to interpret the training descriptions in the game to figure out how to get what you wanted. But see, there were two problems here, alright? Problem number one is that we didn't really know for sure how trainings worked, or that the training sessions the game gives you actually do what they claim to do. And problem number two is that we didn't really know what we wanted training to do. Well, the first problem, figuring out what the trainings actually did, was solved scientifically by Max over at Evidence-Based Football Manager. Max created a series of experiments to see what each training actually did. He did his best to hold all other variables constant to ensure scientific accuracy. The result was a huge collection of tables, which all Football Manager players love, as well as a recommended plug-and-play training schedule. It was a revolutionary approach, and honestly, I'm really a huge fan of it. Max, we miss you, and we hope that you'll come back to us someday. But there was a problem with the evidence-based Football Manager approach. The problem, of course, is that we were not clear at all as to which attributes we really were trying to develop. So let me explain. Every player in Football Manager is represented by a bunch of numerical attributes. This includes attributes that are visible and attributes that are hidden. But it's not clear what these attributes do, which ones are good, which ones are bad, and how to compare them. It seems to me that the community in general has assumed for years that high numbers are good, and that you just want the highest number possible for every single attribute. However, we now know that Football Manager just does not work that way. Some attributes are more important than others. Well, it turns out that you can test attributes in Football Manager with just the same amount of precision that you can test anything else. In fact, the guys over at FM Arena have been doing this testing for years. It's just that the majority of us didn't know about it. And it turns out that increasing pace and acceleration are more closely correlated with winning than any other attributes in the entire game. So when I first started taking Football Manager seriously in late 2020, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I should look for when I scouted for players. I remember sending scouts out, having them come back with a bunch of garbage, and then thinking, you know what, I could probably do this better myself. Most people said at that time that you wanted to look at their personality type to figure out professionalism, and then you wanted to look at their level of determination. The logic was that these things likely had a lot of influence over player development. But it turns out that that was completely wrong. I should have been focusing on pace and acceleration alone and just forgetting everything else. Now, testing for FM24 is not yet 100% complete. However, it is clear that pace and acceleration are the most important. Raising those levels for every player significantly increases your chances of winning if you hold everything else constant, and lowering those levels for every single player will increase your chances of losing significantly. By the way, this has been consistent for every version of Football Manager and is likely true for every one of these games going back to the original Championship Manager. This chart comes from FM23 testing, and it shows that decreasing pace and acceleration has a bigger impact than decreasing any other variable. That includes player morale. In other words, you want them to be fast instead of wanting them to be happy. And if we go back to the FM21 testing charts, we see the exact same pattern. Okay, there have been a lot of studies, a lot of YouTube videos on the subject. There's been a lot of arguing in message boards. I've been part of the arguing. You've seen all of this before. There are people who've given themselves super teams where everybody has pace and acceleration of 20 and then they end up beating the world. Now, you can't find players like that in the game, of course, and so we all thought that it was really silly to attempt to do that sort of thing. But what we never thought of back then is that you could grow players to be like that. It turns out that you can. So it turns out that a Chinese poster over on FM Arena did a bit of work and discovered that the best way to improve acceleration and pace was to not train players at all. You just had to rest them during training time. This lines up very well with a video that Jhuahua did that came out about 9 months ago. Jhuahua gave himself a bunch of super players with a potential ability of 200 and did not train them. They wound up growing into physical wonder kids extremely quickly. And interestingly enough, our Chinese friend discovered that targeting physical attributes with training, which is what you'd expect to work, does not work. Okay, so you're probably wondering now why Evidence-Based Football Manager didn't figure that out. Well, the truth is that Max's problem is that he still had his players playing matches. He had them playing 1 or 2 per week. Now, the Chinese poster who we're talking about started to ban players from matches after he realized that there was some attribute development going on in the match. If you isolate training and look at training alone like this, you will discover that the best training method is no training at all, only rest. Okay, I'm going to skip past a lot of the work that he did. The English that he uses is kind of broken. He used a machine translator. I wish he would have just posted in Chinese, whatever. It can be kind of hard to follow this stuff, so I'll just sum up. In his training, this poster discovered that growth also differs depending on how old the player is. The further away players are from their potential ability, the faster that they will grow. Another poster zeroed in on one specific strategy, one that is pretty easy to follow. And this is where things get really strange, so stick with me. So after all that testing, it turns out that the absolute best strategy to get young players to grow very fast is to rest them, have them do nothing but rest. This trick apparently only works if you're doing nothing but resting training sessions, other than the matches you play, of course. You need your players to literally sit there and do nothing. That will cause them to become really fast. I know, it's crazy. Now, to make sure that they focus their meditation on speed, assign quickness to each player as a training focus category. And then, to make sure that they meditate with intensity, assign rest on the training screen like you see here. No pitch or gym work for the first 3 settings, and then double intensity for the next 2. You are literally telling your players to meditate during their training sessions, and meditation results in them being the best players in the world. Okay, all theological implications aside, this is totally insane. I should note, however, that people who have been testing this have discovered another variation that also works. If you have any training sessions at all, you're going to want a bunch of recovery sessions for some reason. The formula is actually really simple to learn. You want 1 quickness training, 1 attacking training, 1 match practice, and 7 recovery trainings. And the crazy thing about this is that it doesn't really matter where you put those sessions. Back when we would talk a lot about training, there were arguments about, oh, you have too much training on this day, your players are going to be tired, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter, guys. It really doesn't. The formula is simple to learn. You want to have 1 quickness training, 1 attacking training, 1 match practice training, and the 7 recovery trainings. That's it. You can memorize it. That's your training schedule for your older players. That's all there is to it. There are a bunch of different strategies you can try to combine these. In general, I think the easiest to remember is to use nothing but rest for the first 2 years and then use the recovery variant afterwards. Once your players have trained like this for 4 years, in most cases when they're like 19 or 20 years old if they're new gens, take the quickness additional focus off, and that's it. Of course, if that's too complicated for you, you can always just stick with only rest for the entire save, for the entire season, for every player. That actually still works really well. And that's right, that means that meditating with double intensity on speed is much more effective than running sprints.